the last couple of weeks, I've been working on understanding FreeDOS and the source code to FreeDOS, trying to figure out where in my BIOS I'm missing required functionality to get FreeDOS to work. And I've run into a roadblock along the way, and I've not been able to get through it yet. This is another one of these videos where I'm going to kind of talk through the issue I'm having, maybe some of the troubleshooting steps I'm taking, just to maybe give you insight to what I'm seeing and how I guess I'm thinking about the problem. I have started a blog post on this troubleshooting FreeDOS boot. And so I am trying to capture information as I go here, as I'm working my way through this. So do check that out if you're interested or think you can maybe make some suggestions on things I could try. You know, I'm likely missing something relatively simple and obvious to some of you, and any pointers would be helpful. And maybe I'll just emphasize, I don't believe this is an issue, anything to do with FreeDOS itself. This is likely something in my BIOS, or something the way that I'm setting up my CF card, or something maybe even in my hardware, or some hardware that FreeDOS is expecting to be there that isn't there. The issue I'm running into is when I boot FreeDOS, it gets to the point where it actually goes out and looks for my config file, the fdconfig.sys, kind of like a DOS config.sys. And when it goes to do that, it gets to a call inside of a file called execrh.asm. And basically that has to do with the device drivers, and I'll jump into that here in a little bit. But when it gets to that, it's trying to make a call to some type of an interrupt or something that I'm not fully understanding, and then at that point I lose the system. It either locks up or I get some halt type of critical stop message. So maybe just real quick, I'll start up my FreeDOS system here. That is my dev system. And you will notice that I moved away from VirtualBox. I was having too many issues with it, just crashing, constantly crashing every single day. And it has issues when I try to remote into it with remote desktop to the host's PC. And then I'll disconnect and maybe walk over to the machine physically and try to connect in. And when I do that, it crashes every single time, even with the latest version. So I gave up on that. I've switched to Hyper-V to run FreeDOS on, and this has been running well. And so I'm going to go ahead and get logged in here. And on my D drive, I have a few different versions of the build. I have an FD kernel, which is kind of my main source code. I have a master copy of the kernel. I have a couple working copies, this cr0 and cr1, and I'm going to actually go into this fd cr1, and inside of this is basically the FreeDOS source code. And so this is where I am going into the kernel subfolder and I'm editing files. For example, I'm editing a file called fatfs.c, cd kernel edit fatfs.c, and then I can look through, what is this file doing, and I can see it has to do with my file system IO functions, and I can work within this. And then maybe another one that I've been working in is a file called execrh.asm, and this is this request handler for calling device drivers, and this is the file where I'm currently getting stuck in. I'm not sure if it's the cause necessarily of my issue, but this is where I hit the end of the trail. And so let me bring up this other image. And so this image you're seeing here is just showing, I'm trying to understand maybe how, when I turn on the system, how it works through the different steps. And one of the first files loaded is this main, or the content within main.c. And there's an init kernel, there's an init IO, there's an init device, there's an fs config or file system config. And from that, I end up getting into this disk init that you see inside of the source code file of initdisk.c, and somewhere in there, it's calling out to read all partition tables. And at some point, and I don't have it visualized here, but there, I believe it makes an interrupt call that gets me over to the DOS functions of DOS open and DOS open SFT. And DOS OpenSFT gets me to this routine called TrueName, which calls media check, which calls RQ block IO, which gets me to execrh. And that is where I believe what should be happening is within that, it's supposed to jump down, I think, to this floppy.asm and hit up an FL disk changed to check the status if my disk has changed or not. And likely for that to work, it's got to call a BIOS interrupt 13, function 16, I believe. But for some reason, when I get to this execrh and I try to actually make that call for this specific disk changed check, it fails. Now, if I add a little more context to that, here you can see maybe what some of these calls, and I'm kind of working my way from the back end forward because that's where I'm at in the troubleshooting, is to figure out is something not getting filled in correctly as I go. So here you can see that when I get to this execrc, it has something in it called call for strategy. So let me flip over and get back down to that execrc. This is the version I'm working in. And I can see as I scroll down here that there is this macro of execrhm, and both a execrh and it looks like a init execrh will get me to this. But as I look at this code, basically, there's a couple of versions of it. And maybe what I can also do is pull up the version that is actually out on GitHub. So if I go and look at that and I get into my execrh, here's the code for that. And the version I have is maybe a little bit different just because I've taken out a couple of things that I didn't want to have in here. But one of these is this arguments, the way they're handling the arguments. The other way to do it is just this BP plus 4, BP plus 8, as I understand that. And I had found just another version that used this, and I like that better than putting this in. But these should be comparable as far as the code is concerned. But in this, I can see that there's supposed to be, DS and DI are supposed to point to this device header and ESBX to this request header. And then there's something in here called it says construct strategy address and then call for the strategy. And I don't know what that is trying to be doing there. And obviously there's a colorful commentary here about some sound driver, it looks like, that maybe isn't written well. But it makes this call, and then it turns around and it makes another call down here. And this routine gets called many times when my system boots, and they all work fine until I get to the one where I'm actually trying to go check on the disk status. It's a block IO device instead of some of these other IO devices. And when it gets to this call, it's calling an address that just doesn't seem right. So maybe I'm not getting the right things brought into this routine as far as these arguments. And so that's where I'm kind of working backwards to see if I can track down what in the world is going on there. Now, the version I have over here to the left, the only difference really in this is I've put in a bunch of debug. So I print out an RH anytime I get into this with a space. And then I print out, basically, I take my BP and put that into AX, and basically I print out the low part of that. So the AL is what I'm going to print out. So I'm going to my base pointer and printing out AL in hex, and then I put equals, and then I put in the value that's being pointed to BP plus 7, plus 6, plus 5, plus 4 with a colon in between. So I believe that should be printing out essentially this same thing that's being pointed to over here when it comes to this device header. So I'm just trying to see what address or what's in there, I guess, as this is being run, just to see if I can understand what in the world is going on. Now, if I show my system booting up, here I'm turning on my system, and I'll probably cut a couple of these pieces a little short as I go through this, but on the left is my VGA output. On the right is a bunch of logging that I do. And if I pause it just for a second here on the logging, one of the first things I do is I show cylinders, heads, sectors that I'm reading from the CF card. I then show this block of text that is in this case, my master boot record. So the very first sector on the disk, and that then is going to load up the boot sector, which is a little bit later in the disk, and jump to it. That's then going to look for, find my kernel.sys and start processing the kernel sys. And all of that is working fine. And I'm logging along the way here, and if I pause it again, you'll see that anytime I make an interrupt call, like interrupt 13, function 42, or function 41, I show what all my registers and things coming into that are. And then anytime I make a call to the disk trying to read from it, I'm doing everything in LBA, so I'm forcing LBA both at the boot sector and at the kernel level in FreeDOS. I show the LBA value, and then I show my converted CHS value that it's using internally. So I understand, what am I asking for in LBA, and then my internal routines just to validate I'm converting the numbers correctly. And so far, I think that all looks right. But I'll let this run, and as this runs, it's doing its normal booting and initializing, and I've put a bunch of extra logging throughout this. So this is the debug version. So I've built this with the debug turned on, so it's kicking out extra logging, plus I'm adding additional logging to that. And you can see it comes up, and a lot of what you see on the screen is your normal FreeDOS boot type of stuff, and then I'm injecting all this other stuff. And where you see that RH space 2CE32, that's where it's making a call into that routine that later is going to cause my system to lock up. Then I clear the screen when I hit the end so I can keep logging out to my VGA. I don't have intelligence for scrolling in there yet. But what you're seeing is that it's basically just logging this output as it goes. And you can see it gets to the init disk. I have no errors or warnings about mismatched any sizes or anything like that because I am using LBA. And you can even see it says LBA enabled for drive C. It figures out what fat cluster size I need to be working with. And then it gets in and starts configuring basically the different, I think it's like IO ports, serial ports, things like that as part of this FS config. Here it's doing my aux setup, and then we'll eventually get into where it's looking for, I can see it's gone from aux to con. Now I think it's going to get into my config sys or fdconf.sys. And so here it's trying to go check for that file just to see if it exists. And I don't have that file on my CF card. I don't need it to boot up for what I'm trying to do here. So it should go do a check, find out that it's not there, come back and just move on and say, okay, I don't have it, and get me to a prompt for a date time. But that's not what I'm seeing. And what I'm seeing instead is that I then eventually get down to this, where it says HMA state. I'm just double checking that my stuff didn't get loaded into HMA because I have no high memory on this computer. I just have 640K. And then I get into that RH again, and this time it just looks different. So the 874 seems about right, and that's pointing to BP, but then it's pointing to 8692B859 for this thing that it seems to be trying to reference, and I don't know that. All the other ones were at 0070, 0218, and this one is different, and it doesn't like it. So whenever it does that call, there's something it doesn't like with it. I then come back with an invalid opcode, but then it tries the same one that I've seen previously, the 70:218, and then I get a DOS memory corrupt and some other dumping out that I haven't tried to figure out how to decipher that dump yet. But I look at this and it just, something doesn't seem right, obviously, at that point. So the question is, what's going on? And if I flip back over to my DOS code here for a second, and I go down and look at what it's doing, or on the code, maybe even to the right would be a better place to look at this. When it gets to this call right here, that's where it's failing. So I have to do some more searching and understand what does it mean when it says construct strategy address and call for the strategy. And then down here it actually does some call for an interrupt. So calling an interrupt, that makes sense to me. And this interrupt that I would expect again goes back to this other visual here, where I would expect that it's trying to get to this floppy file, and if I go back to that for a second, I can edit floppy. Let's see, actually that's back a folder, and I believe there's a drivers. So if I go into drivers, I can edit floppy.asm. And inside of here is, I think, where it might be trying to get to, because this does have a disks changed procedure that should allow me to check whether or not my disk line has changed. And that should be calling an interrupt, I would think, interrupt 13, and it's function 16, but I don't see that interrupt ever come through. I don't think it gets to the floppy code in here, because I do have some debug in here that just tries to at least print out to say I've gotten to this DC, just some characters that I print out to show that I'm into disk change, but I don't ever get to that point. And I think I should get there if I'm guessing where this is trying to jump to. But on the code on the right here, again, I don't quite understand what it's trying to jump to. And I would say that on my logged output, when I go back to that, the jump to address, every time I build it, it seems like it's a little bit different address. This right down here where it says RH0874 equals, and then 8692, that part seems to change depending on even minor changes to my kernel file, as an example. So the things that come to mind for me is there's something earlier in the process that didn't fill in something that it needed for this device header or request header. So I've got to track that back and see if I can figure out what's going on there. Or am I somewhere overwriting memory? And I don't know if that's the case or not, but this is showing that my maybe my base pointer is at, or my stack base BP basically is at an address. Maybe there's something else stepping on that. I don't think so. And I've tried to double check if that's the case, and I'm not finding anything yet. But that's kind of where I'm at. So I'm working on this. If anybody has thoughts, if you've seen how this execrh.asm works in FreeDOS, and you can shed any light on that, what is it actually trying to call when it says call for strategy? And how would I track down what memory address it should be getting to, and why am I not getting a proper address in there, if that's if I'm interpreting this correctly, which I very well might not be. So I am, again, no expert in assembly or C code, but I'm trying to navigate my way through this and see if I can get this to work. If I can't track back where I'm missing something, populating whatever here, I'll probably just start putting in my own kernel instead of the FreeDOS one, or have the FreeDOS one stop at a certain point and maybe just try to more manually get into the file system myself and bypass some of this driver type of functionality in FreeDOS. That still isn't a fix, but maybe that will help me out ultimately identify what the root cause of this issue might be. I know many of you pay attention to all the little details here and are very sharp and have a lot of experience with this. So if you have suggestions, do please let me know, and I greatly appreciate it. So more to come as I have updates.